Fashion Through the Ages, The History of Costume. Part 2, The Dark Ages Through the 17th Century. Migrations, new trade routes, changes in building styles, and the transformation of old ideas into new ones affected fashions from the Dark Ages through the 17th century. For centuries, tribal migrations had been continuous in Central Europe. Many of these tribes wore a similar garment they called brays, or braccae, a kind of loose-fitting breeches secured around the waist with a cord or string. Gradually, their costumes and customs, including the use of trousers, influenced the settled societies of Europe. The Celts, a highly cultured tribe which had been Romanized, also wore a type of trousers. Over these, they would wear knee-length tunics. A cape or mantle made from fur or cloth would be flung across the shoulders and fastened together on the right shoulder with a metal pin similar to these. Most Celtic men wore shoulder-length hair and long drooping mustaches. Celtic women wore long tunics with short or long sleeves depending upon the season. Their tunics were belted at the waist, and to complete their costumes, they wore long cloaks around their shoulders. The ends of the cloak were brought together and fastened with a brooch, or fibula. Celtic women wore their hair long. The Celts were skilled metalworkers and accomplished goldsmiths. Many pieces of their work have been unearthed in Great Britain and can be seen in museums across the country. Their gold neck rings are called torques. The Romans who occupied Great Britain until the 5th century adopted trousers as part of their clothing, as can be seen in this mosaic of a Roman soldier. But when they returned to Rome, they discontinued wearing this garment because they considered trousers to be the clothing of barbarians. Very little is known about the clothing worn during the early years of the Middle Ages. Most information on clothes during this period comes from pictures and early manuscripts. In 771 AD, Charlemagne became the ruler over all the territory occupied by the Franks. By 800 AD, Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne Roman Emperor in the West, thus uniting all of Western Europe except for Spain and Britain. Charlemagne and other Frankish noblemen wore a linen shirt and linen brays or breeches that came to the knees. Over these, they wore a belted tunic that had a colorful border. A mantle or cloak lined with fur or silk would be pinned on the right shoulder. For formal events, an ankle-length tunic that had wide sleeves would be worn with a long cloak. Most of the common men wore short tunics over their undershirts and trousers. However, both wealthy and common men wore a form of leg coverings. The most important costume development during the Carolingian era was the way the leg coverings were arranged to indicate one's rank. Generally, the nobility wore fitted leg coverings, while others wore loose and baggy leg coverings. The length of tunics also distinguished the upper from the lower classes. The only exception to this was the dress of the Christian clergy. They wore long tunic gowns until the 12th century. Women of the Carolingian era wore undergarments similar to those of the men, except that the undershirt was a long-sleeved ankle-length gown called a chemise. Worn over the chemise was a full gown which had embroidered bands that went around the neck and down the front of the garment. During the Romanesque era, from the 9th through the 12th centuries, there were at least 3 consistent trends found in European costumes. First was the constant use of trousers and hose. Second was the elaborate styles adapted from the Byzantine gowns that were worn by the wealthy. And third, the emphasis placed on clothes worn by men rather than women. Costume styles changed very little during the 9th and 10th centuries. Both sexes wore long-sleeved belted tunics called blios. Women wore their blios long and full, while men's blios were usually knee-length or longer and split up the sides. In 1066, William of Normandy conquered England. A distinguishing characteristic of the knights who supported William was their hairstyle. They grew their hair to medium length, then brushed it forward toward the face and shaved the back of their heads from ear to ear, leaving a bald area from their necks to the tops of their ears. Norman men wore longer tunics than the Anglo-Saxons, yet the nobility of both groups wore very long tunics. Usually, the Normans wore 2 tunics, regardless of the length. The undertunics were made from linen and had long fitted sleeves. The second tunic, called a dalmatic, flared from the waistline and had shorter, wider sleeves. One of the earliest sources of visual information we have on the clothing worn by ordinary people during the Middle Ages is the Bayeux Tapestry. This famous embroidered linen piece has 58 scenes depicting the Norman conquest of England. On this tapestry we can see some of the characters wearing the short tunic and what appears as knitted stockings. Also, we can see knights dressed in chainmail and tunics. In 1095 A.D., Pope Urban II proclaimed the Crusades, decreeing that Christians were to liberate the Holy Land and drive out the Muslims. Many new trade routes were established as a result of the Crusades, and materials from remote areas began to enter Europe. With the new trade routes came economic prosperity, and many merchants and craftsmen acquired substantial sums of money. This new wealth introduced another class rank into society, the middle class. Knights returning from the Crusades brought with them several Oriental styles of clothing. One was an exotic type of flowing robe which had very wide sleeves and was open down the front. They also brought back the turban, which became somewhat popular. Oriental costumes affected the designs of clothes, especially those made from exotic fabrics. Another clothing change resulting from the Crusades was the use of symbolic decorations on the fronts and backs of men's tunics and their armor. The Knights of St. John wore the Maltese cross on their garments, and the Knights Templar wore a red cross on their surcoats, which were the tunics worn over their chainmail armor. These decorations helped to identify from a distance the group with which a knight was associated. The Gothic era replaced the Romanesque in the mid-12th century. This period is known chiefly for changes introduced into the architecture of churches, which now stressed graceful vertical lines, pointed arches, and beautiful stained glass windows. These styles were also reflected in Gothic costumes. Notice the slender, dignified look, pointed toes on shoes, pointed sleeves, and contrasting colors in clothing and jewels. The basic garments of most men in the early Gothic years were long undershirts and briefs, which were called slops. They wore tunics over slops and covered their legs with hose. The French introduced a new fashion called a cyclis, which was a sleeveless calf-length garment, usually shorter in front than the back, and it could be belted at the waist. Many men in the early Gothic years wore hoods over their heads. These hoods usually had a long tail or liripipe coming from the point of the hood. Some of these liripipes were 5 to 6 feet in length. Eleanor of Aquitaine, wife of Henry II of England, ruled over a court of love, and from this court, an elaborate code of chivalry was developed which changed the role women played in society and affected fashion. Up to this time, cathedrals had been named after warrior saints. Now the cathedrals began to be dedicated to such feminine saints as the Virgin Mary. The historical chronicles of the Middle Ages were written by men, and reflected the heroic deeds of other men. Included in these chronicles were descriptions of men's attire. For example, the description of the wedding attire of Richard the Lionhearted has been preserved in detail. He wore a tunic of rose-colored satin and a long mantle of striped silver material with a gold crescent moon pattern. Historical novelist Thomas B. Costain has stated, "What the bride wore was not considered important enough to set down." In the early Gothic years, women began to wear undergowns with tight sleeves over which they would wear a sleeveless garment called a pelicon. Usually, these pelicons were loose-fitting and had long trains of material in the back. The women covered their heads with silk or a gauze-like veil. Later, a new head covering appeared, the wimple, which was a short length of material draped under the chin and pulled up to the hairline on each side of the head. Either a veil or fillet was worn over the top of the head. When Edward III ruled England from 1327 to 1377, the basic clothing styles for both men and women were close-fitting, and much stress was placed upon ornamentation. This has been called the decorated Gothic period. It was a time for wearing family crests as a decorative part of one's garment. Through marriage, many of the crests and their colors were intermingled and adapted to clothing. Some rather startling results came from this practice. One might find a gentleman wearing a surcoat which was half red and half orange. The traditional colorful clothing worn by court jesters of this era can be seen in the costumes of modern clowns. The basic male clothing shifted from the surcoat, which had been loose-fitting, to a new design called the cotardy. This garment was close-fitted and had elbow-length wide sleeves. Pockets were also introduced in the cotardys. Later, a super cotardy became popular. It differed from the plain one in having a standing collar and fitted sleeves, and it ended just at the hip line. It is believed that the cotardy design came from the jupon, or pourpoint, worn by the military at the turn of the 14th century. The women's cotardy was a full-length fitted gown with elbow-length sleeves. It was without a belt and had a low, wide neckline. Another popular garment for women during the second half of the 14th century was a sideless gown which was worn over the cotardy, exposing the area from under the arms to the hips. When Richard II became King of England in 1377, clothing entered a new phase in the use of decorations. Richard was interested in the latest fashions and fads, and during his reign, a new garment called a houppeland came into style. This floor-length garment, with enormous sleeves and a high collar, probably originated in Spain. The edgings on the sleeves of the houppeland, called dags, were cut or scalloped, and at times were decorated with jewels and embroidery. Women of this era also wore the houppeland, but women's fashions were more concerned with a variety of elaborate headdresses. First, we see the typical headdress, in which the hair was brought forward and rolled into a horn shape and covered with a jeweled caul or netted cap. Veils were used to highlight these hats. The most popular headdresses were of cone-shaped design. These were made from brocade, velvet, gold, or silver material that was stiffened and rolled into a cone and then attached to a black velvet frontlet or ring on the forehead. Usually, the cone headdress was worn at a 40-degree angle and had a transparent veil attached to the top. It was popular for women to shave the hair from their foreheads to give them a fashionably high hairline. They also plucked their eyebrows to a fine line so that artificial eyebrows could be painted higher. These features can be seen in many of the portraits painted in the 14th and 15th centuries. During this time, the common man and woman still wore simple garments. Men would wear a simple tunic and natural hairstyles. Women wore basic short-sleeved dresses over their chemises, and very plain coverchiefs, or kerchiefs, covered their hair. During the middle of the 15th century, the Italians introduced a Renaissance, or rebirth of classicism. People again looked at the arts as an application of form and balance. Fashion, too, reflected the new ideas. Clothing was designed to have a harmonious relationship with the simple and natural lines of the body. While stylish Northern Europeans still wore heavily padded and highly decorative clothing, the Italians in the South began to simplify their styles. This interest in new costume designs resulted in the development of a textile industry in northern Italy, with Florence the center of many fabric guilds. Italian men began wearing a tight-fitting basic garment that consisted of long hose or tights and a doublet, which was a form of a jacket. Under their doublets, they wore silk or taffeta shirts because people believed these materials kept fleas away from the body. Since the upper garments were often shorter than the crotch line, a new item in the clothing world was introduced, the codpiece, which was attached to the front of the hose for purposes of modesty. Young men wore short cloaks, while older men preferred ankle-length gowns. Hat styles varied from a plain brimless hat of medium height to a floppy round hat. The floor-length dresses worn by Italian Renaissance women had low, square necklines and tight-fitting bodices. Puffed sleeves were often made from contrasting colors and were sometimes left open from the shoulder to the elbow, letting the undersleeve of the chemise show through the opening. Italian women preferred to wear their hair in simple styles, and blonde hair was popular. Many dark-haired women spent hours bleaching their hair. Men were generally clean-shaven, but some wore beards in a variety of shapes. Flanders was another prosperous and style-conscious area during the mid-15th century. An expanding wool trade brought great wealth into the court of Burgundy. This rich and powerful state set the styles for most of the European costumes. Burgundian dress for men consisted of short, pleated, padded tunics and tight hose having pointed toes. Many of the young men wore tall hats over their bushy hair. Burgundian women wore high-waisted, long-trained gowns. The necklines of these gowns were fur-trimmed and plunged downward, having a decorative insertion called a plastron placed in the front of the bodice. Tall, bejeweled headdresses completed their costumes. The elegant Burgundian style flourished from 1440 to 1480. During these years, the hood with the liripipe, which had been worn by most males throughout Europe, was changed. Philip the Good, one of the Dukes of Burgundy, is shown wearing the new style. Here the hood is wound around his head and tied in place, with the liripipe forming a turban-like hat. From 1485 to 1603, the Tudors reigned in England. Fashions at court changed very little during Henry VII's reign, but Henry VIII was more fashion-conscious. Wealthy men wore doublets padded with straw, which featured enormous sleeves. The doublets were slashed to reveal an underlayer of material. A large robe trimmed in fur was sometimes worn, as seen in this portrait of Henry VIII. Many men wore the codpiece during his reign. Men's shoes were square-toed, without heels, and made of leather, silk, or velvet. Fashionable women wore gowns with low, square necklines. The ruffled edge of the chemise usually showed over the top of the neckline. Sleeves would be somewhat tight at the shoulders, but would gradually widen down the arm to become long and full, with ruffles of lace around the wrist. The skirts of the gowns were open from the waist to the floor, exposing an undergown. The most typical head covering worn by these women was the gabled hood that was stiffened and decorated. During the reign of Elizabeth I, the English court increased in splendor. This was due to the wealth brought back to England by the expeditions of men like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. Women's fashion at this time consisted of long-waisted dresses worn over a bell-shaped, stiff undergarment called a farthingale petticoat, which had been designed by the Spanish. Since this was one of the first hooped framework skirts to enter the fashion scene, it was referred to as the Spanish farthingale, to distinguish it from later designs. Later, in the 16th century, the French changed the shape of the farthingale by designing the hoops into a drum or wheel-shaped style. As the 16th century continued, the wheel-shaped farthingale increased in width until this vast shape became the style associated with the Elizabethan era. The children of the era dressed in the same type of garments as the adults. The gowns that were worn over the wheel-shaped farthingales were made in two parts, consisting of a bodice that had a long, deep point in front and a skirt full enough to fit over the hooped petticoat. The triangular shape shown on this bodice could be sewn into the material, or could be a separate piece called a stomacher, which would be attached at the neckline of the bodice. The stomacher remained in fashion throughout the 16th century and into the 18th century. To complete the dresses worn during the Elizabethan period, one would see a tall, wired lace collar attached to the bodice, or a huge cartwheel ruff collar tied around the neck over the top of the bodice. The cartwheel ruff collars worn by English women were introduced by Catherine de Medicis when she married Henry II of France. These collars became very popular in Holland, Spain, France, and England. Spanish fashions continued to be an influencing factor on the styles worn in the rest of Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. The next framework design coming out of Spain was the wide-hipped, basket-shaped form that was attached to a petticoat and tied on at the waist. The French called this new design panier, meaning basket, and this was the name that endured. The pannier petticoat stayed in fashion for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, but its form was changed several times during those years. At first, the shape was circular, and the hoops gave a lilting, gentle motion to the skirts as the women walked. Later, the style was changed into a more elliptical form that was flatter in the front and back and wider on the sides. With this design, women had to turn sideways in order to go through doorways. By 1750, the sides of the pannier were excessively wide. During the 17th and 18th centuries, men continued to wear the same styles they had been wearing during Henry VIII's reign, except the cut became narrower. In order to achieve the narrow-waisted look, many men wore corsets. The only new item added to their costumes was the heavily starched ruff collar. Both sexes wore large amounts of jewelry, with their favorite jewel being the tear-shaped pearl. Another interesting fashion item during this century was the wearing of wool hats by all English men and boys on Sunday. This fashion was prompted by a law passed in the late 1500s designed to keep the wool trade flourishing.